June 1945, and a military transport truck rumbles through the outskirts of Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas. The war in Europe ended just weeks ago, but the machinery of occupation and detention still grinds forward, processing thousands of captured Axis personnel. Inside this particular truck sits a group that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. 23 German women, ranging from 18 to 42 years old, dressed in a mixture of faded Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms and civilian clothes that haven't been washed properly in weeks. These women aren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They're Nachrichtenhelferinnen, communications auxiliaries who operated switchboards and radios for German military units. Some served as Flakhelferinnen, anti-aircraft auxiliaries who tracked Allied bombers. Others worked as clerical staff in Wehrmacht administrative offices. All of them were captured during the chaotic final weeks of the war as Allied forces swept through Germany, and all of them expected execution or, at best, years of hard labor in prisoner camps. What they didn't expect was Texas. Gerda Hoffmann, a former telephone operator from Hamburg, peers through the canvas covering a landscape that looks like it belongs on another planet. Everything is flat, impossibly flat, stretching to horizons that seem twice as far away as German horizons. The heat is suffocating, a dry, relentless pressure that makes her wool skirt cling to her legs. Strange birds, she'll later learn, are called turkey vultures, circle lazily overhead. In the distance, oil derricks pump rhythmically, their mechanical arms rising and falling like giant insects feeding on the earth. The truck slows as it approaches a checkpoint. American soldiers wave them through with casual efficiency that unsettles Gerda more than hostility would have. Where is the hatred? Where are the revenge-minded victors she'd been warned about in those final desperate briefings before? Capture? The women exchange nervous glances, speaking in whispered German, trying to prepare themselves for whatever comes next. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The processing facility at Fort Sam Houston in June 1945 was overwhelmed. The US military had prepared for massive numbers of German POWs, male soldiers by the hundreds of thousands. But the auxiliary women presented unique challenges. Geneva Convention protocols didn't clearly address female military auxiliaries. Were they combatants? Civilians? Something in between? The American military establishment, fundamentally unprepared for German women in quasi-military roles, made decisions on the fly. Most of these women were initially held in converted barracks at Fort Sam Houston while officials determined their status. They weren't technically prisoners of war in the Geneva Convention sense because they hadn't been armed combatants. But they weren't simple displaced persons either. They'd worn uniforms, served military functions, and in some cases had been present at military installations when captured. The solution was a hybrid detention system, less restrictive than POW camps, but more controlled than displaced persons centers. The women who arrived that June morning had survived journeys that would have broken many. Margarete Schneider, a former Luftwaffe clerk from Stuttgart, had been captured by American forces in Bavaria in late April 1945. She'd spent 3 weeks in a temporary holding facility in a bombed-out school, sleeping on concrete floors, eating whatever rations the overwhelmed American Quartermaster Corps could spare. Then came a truck convoy to an airfield, a cargo plane flight across the Atlantic that left her vomiting into a paper bag for hours, and finally the truck ride through Texas terrain that looked more alien than anything she imagined. The initial processing took 3 days. American female military personnel, WACs from the Women's Army Corps, conducted interviews through translators. The questions focused on determining Nazi Party affiliation, war crimes involvement, and intelligence value. Most of these women had joined auxiliary services because German law in 1943 and 44 had made it mandatory for unmarried women under 35. They had no more choice than conscripted male soldiers. Some had been genuine Nazi believers. Most had simply done what they were told to avoid imprisonment, or worse. What struck the women most forcefully during those first days wasn't interrogation or harsh treatment, it was abundance. The mess hall served meals that exceeded anything they'd eaten since before the war. Real eggs, white bread, coffee with actual sugar, fresh fruit that hadn't been reserved exclusively for military officers or party officials. Elise Becker, a former radar operator from Berlin, later wrote in her memoir that she cried the first time an American mess sergeant piled scrambled eggs onto her tray without measuring or rationing them. The American WWII assigned to supervise the German women treated them with professional distance but not cruelty. Captain Mary Ellen Rodriguez from Corpus Christi, Texas, spoke to the women through translators with a directness that Germans found both refreshing and unsettling. "You're not going to be tortured," she explained during the orientation session. "You're going to be housed here while we determine your individual situations. You'll have medical care, regular meals, and basic amenities. In exchange, you'll follow camp regulations and cooperate with ongoing interviews. This isn't a vacation, but it's not a concentration camp either." That phrase, concentration camp, hung in the air. These women knew what concentration camps were. Some had seen them. A few had worked near them in administrative capacities and carried guilt that would haunt them for decades. The fact that their American captors explicitly stated they wouldn't operate such facilities suggested a fundamental difference in values that many of these women were only beginning to grasp. By the third week of June 1945, the women had settled into an uneasy routine at Fort Sam Houston. They were housed in a separate section of the base, away from male POWs, with female guards and administrators. The barracks were basic but clean, with proper beds, running water, and bathroom facilities that worked. After years of wartime privation in Germany, where Allied bombing had destroyed infrastructure and basic services, these amenities felt luxurious. The women organized themselves according to habits formed in military service. They appointed a spokeswoman, Anna Weber, a 38-year-old former Wehrmacht administrative sergeant who spoke decent English. They established cleaning rotations, meal protocols, and dispute resolution systems. Structure provided comfort in the face of profound uncertainty about their futures. Medical examinations revealed the toll of war and captivity. Most women were underweight, suffering from vitamin deficiencies, dental problems, and stress-related conditions. The American military doctors treated them without judgment, providing medications, dental care, and nutritional supplements. A doctor named Lieutenant James Morrison told Gerda Hoffman through a translator, "Whatever happened during the war, you're under American care now, and we treat patients, not enemies." That attitude, that fundamental separation between wartime enmity and human dignity, confused many of the women. They'd been raised in a system where ideology determined treatment, where your value as a human being depended on your race, your loyalty to the party, your usefulness to the state. The American approach seemed almost incomprehensible. Why would victors treat defeated enemies with basic decency? The answer came gradually through observation and interaction. The American military personnel at Fort Sam Houston weren't motivated by ideology in the German sense. They followed regulations, yes, but those regulations were based on concepts like rule of law, human rights, and the Geneva Conventions. Even when individuals held personal animosity toward Germans, and many did, especially those who'd lost loved ones in combat, the system constrained them from acting on that hatred. Late June brought the first real glimpse of Texas culture beyond the military base. The women were allowed supervised walks around certain areas of Fort Sam Houston for exercise and mental health purposes. These walks took them past sections where off-duty American soldiers congregated, and that's when the women first encountered Texas servicemen who weren't career military but rather cowboys doing their wartime duty. Corporal Jake Matheson from a ranch outside of Fredericksburg was the first cowboy most of these women actually spoke to. He was assigned to the transportation unit and happened to be present when a truck carrying some of the German women broke down near the motor pool. Jake, who'd been breaking horses since he was 10 years old and had fixed more truck engines than he could count, grabbed his toolbox and set to work while the women waited under guard in the shade. The German women watched this American soldier with fascination. He moved with a loose-limbed confidence that seemed distinctly unmilitary. His uniform fit oddly, as if he'd rather be wearing something else. When he removed his cap to wipe sweat from his forehead, they saw sun-bleached brown hair and a face weathered by outdoor work, not combat. He whistled while he worked, some tune they didn't recognize, and occasionally spoke to the truck engine as if it were a stubborn animal that needed coaxing. When he finished, and the engine roared to life, he turned to the women and said in accented but understandable German, "Alles, gut. Should get you where you're going now." The women stared. An American soldier who spoke German? Jake grinned at their surprise. My grandmother was from Bavaria. She made sure I learned proper German, not just the Texas kind. That brief interaction planted seeds. This American, this cowboy soldier, didn't fit the propaganda image German women had absorbed for years. He wasn't a brutal thug or a money-obsessed materialist. He was a working man who fixed things, spoke their language because of family heritage, and treated them like human beings rather than defeated enemies. The real transformation began in mid-July 1945 when American authorities made a decision that would have been unthinkable in German POW camps. They determined that the detained German women, having been cleared of war crimes and deemed low security risks, could participate in supervised work details that would take them off base into the surrounding Texas communities. The labor shortage in Texas remained acute despite the war's end. Farms needed workers, hospitals needed staff, and German women with clerical or medical training could fill gaps while awaiting repatriation to Europe. The first work detail departed Fort Sam Houston on July 16, 1945. 12 German women, including Gerda Hoffmann and Margarete Schneider, climbed into a truck driven by Sergeant Bill Crawford, a rancher from Wilson County who'd been assigned to the liaison program. They were heading to the Schultz Ranch, a sprawling cattle operation about 40 miles southeast of San Antonio that had contracted with the military for labor assistance. The drive itself was an education. The women had never seen landscape like this. Miles and miles of rolling hills dotted with live oaks, their twisted branches creating pockets of shade in an otherwise sun-blasted environment. Cattle grazed in vast pastures that dwarfed anything they'd known in Germany. The sky seemed impossibly large, a dome of blue, so intense it hurt to look at directly. Sergeant Crawford tried to make conversation, asking about Germany, about their families, about whether they'd ever worked on farms. The women responded cautiously at first, uncertain how much friendliness to accept from their captors. But Crawford's manner was easy, unthreatening. He told them about his ranch, about the drought that had hurt his cattle operation in '44, about his son who was serving with Patton's army in the occupation of Germany, probably walking around the same towns you girls came from, he said without apparent irony. When they arrived at the Schultz Ranch, the women encountered something that would change their understanding of America fundamentally. They met actual working cowboys. The Schultz Ranch employed 7 full-time hands, men whose lives revolved around cattle, horses, and land. These weren't soldiers playing at being cowboys. They were the real thing. Men who'd grown up in saddles, who spoke a dialect of English the women could barely understand, whose hands were scarred from rope burns and barbed wire cuts. Some were too old for military service. Others had been classified as essential agricultural workers and exempted from the draft. All of them viewed the arrival of German women workers with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. Ranch foreman Tom Baylor, a 53-year-old man who'd been working cattle since the age of 12, sized up the new arrivals with the practiced eye of someone evaluating livestock. He saw city women mostly, soft hands and pale skin that hadn't seen real outdoor labor. But he also saw something else: determination, resilience, the kind of toughness that comes from surviving total war. "Welcome to Texas," he said through the translator that military authorities had provided. "We're going to teach you how real work gets done." The women didn't realize it yet, but they were about to receive an intensive education in a culture completely foreign to everything they'd known. A culture where individual skill mattered more than rank, where respect was earned through competence rather than granted by authority, and where men judged you by what you could do, not by your gender or nationality. The first day at the Schultz Ranch nearly broke them. The women were assigned to work in the large garden that supplied vegetables for the ranch operation, to help with meal preparation in the ranch cookhouse, and to assist with various maintenance tasks around the compound. Simple enough, except that Texas heat in July is merciless. By 10 in the morning, temperatures exceeded 100 degrees. By noon, it felt like standing in an oven. Gerda Hoffman, working in the garden pulling weeds alongside a ranch wife named Betty Schultz, felt sweat soaking through her clothes within the first hour. Her hands, soft from years of telephone operation work, quickly blistered from handling tools. The sun beat down with an intensity she'd never experienced in northern Germany, where even summer days carried a coolness in the shade. Betty watched the German women struggle and did something that surprised them. She called for a break, brought out water with salt tablets, and showed them how to wet bandanas and wear them around their necks to help with cooling. "You can't work in this heat like you would up north," she explained through the translator. "Down here, you work early morning and evening, rest during the worst heat, and drink more water than you think you need." That simple act of practical kindness, showing them how to survive Texas summer rather than letting them suffer for being German, planted another seed. These American ranch people weren't trying to torture them through labor. They were teaching them skills, treating them like inexperienced workers rather than hated enemies. The real revelation came during the lunch break, when the women were invited to eat with the ranch hands under a large covered pavilion behind the main house. Long wooden tables held platters of food that seemed almost obscene in their abundance. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, cornbread, iced tea in pitchers beaded with condensation. The women stood uncertainly until Tom Baylor waved them forward. "Don't be shy. You're working, you're eating. That's how it works here." The ranch hands had initially kept their distance, uncertain how to interact with enemy women. But food has a way of breaking down barriers. As everyone ate, one of the younger cowboys, a 22-year-old named Danny Pierce, started asking questions. Where in Germany were they from? What was it like there? Had they really not had enough food during the war? The conversation started awkwardly, filtered through the military translator, but gradually found rhythm. Margaret Schneider described Hamburg before the firebombing, the beautiful old buildings, the harbour filled with ships, the Christmas markets her family had attended every year. Danny listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed curiosity rather than judgment. He told them about growing up on a ranch in the hill country, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about the rhythms of cattle work that had defined his entire existence. One of the older cowboys, a man named Charlie Hendricks, who'd been working ranches since 1920, suddenly asked a question that cut through the pleasantries. "Did y'all know? About the camps, the Jewish people, all that?" The table went silent. The German women froze, uncertain how to answer. Some had known, some had suspected, some had deliberately avoided knowing. The truth was complicated, shameful, impossible to articulate in a language they barely spoke. Elise Becker, the former radar operator, finally spoke through the translator, with tears streaming down her face. "We heard rumors. Some of us saw things. We were afraid. That's not an excuse, just the truth. We were cowards." Charlie nodded slowly, his weathered face unreadable. Then he said something that shocked everyone. "I reckon that's honest. Most folks are cowards when it comes down to it, including me. At least you're not lying about it now." That moment of brutal honesty cleared the air. The Germans weren't going to be excused for their nation's crimes, but neither were they going to be endlessly punished as individuals for things beyond their control. The cowboys operated on a simple frontier ethic: judge people by their current actions, not their past associations. If these women worked hard and dealt straight, they'd be treated fairly. It was a moral framework that many of the German women found both refreshing and challenging. The afternoon brought the women's first real exposure to cowboy culture in action. After the midday heat broke slightly around 4 o'clock, Tom Baylor announced it was time to move some cattle from the south pasture to fresh grazing land. Several of the ranch hands saddled horses with practiced efficiency that looked like choreographed dance. The German women watched from the fence line, fascinated by the relationship between these men and their animals. Jake Matheson, the cowboy they'd met at Fort Sam Houston, who'd since been reassigned to help with the labor program, rode over to the fence where the women stood. "Want to see what real work looks like?" he asked in his grandmother's Bavarian German. Before anyone could object, he reached down and pulled Gerda Hoffmann up behind him on the horse. She gasped, grabbing onto his waist instinctively as the horse moved forward. For Gerda, that moment was transformative. She'd never been on a horse before, never felt the powerful muscles moving beneath her, never experienced the sense of controlled chaos as Jake guided the animal into a loping gait toward where the other cowboys were gathering the cattle herd. The world looked different from horseback, larger somehow, more immediate. She could smell leather and horse sweat, Texas dust, could feel the animals breathing, could sense the absolute confidence with which Jake sat in the saddle, as natural there as most people were in chairs. The cattle work itself was a revelation. The cowboys moved as a coordinated unit without apparent commands, reading each other's positions, using their horses to guide the herd toward the open gate leading to the new pasture. When a young steer tried to break away from the group, Danny Pierce's horse responded instantly, cutting off the animal's escape route with movements so precise they seemed telepathic. The cowboy barely appeared to give any signals, yet the horse knew exactly what to do. One cowboy, riding a paint horse with distinctive markings, began swinging a rope in wide circles above his head. The German women watched in confusion until suddenly he released the loop, which sailed through the air and dropped perfectly over the head of a calf that had wandered too far from its mother. The horse immediately planted its feet, the rope went taut, and the cowboy dismounted in one fluid motion, approaching the calf to check for some condition that had caught his attention. The entire sequence took perhaps 15 seconds and demonstrated a level of skill that left the German women speechless. When the cattle work finished and Jake rode back to the fence with Gerda still clinging to his back, she was shaking, not from fear but from exhilaration. She'd just witnessed something that contradicted everything Nazi ideology had taught her about Americans. These weren't soft, decadent people, made weak by democracy and materialism. These were men whose competence and physical courage would have impressed any Wehrmacht officer. The difference was that they'd developed these qualities through individual choice and personal pride, not through military discipline and state coercion. That evening, as the military truck prepared to transport the women back to Fort Sam Houston, Tom Baylor approached Sergeant Crawford with a request. "Some of these girls show promise," he said. "The one with the blonde hair, she's got good hands in the garden and doesn't complain. The darker-haired one asks good questions about the cattle. If they're coming back, I'd like to start teaching them some real ranch skills. We're short-handed, and capable workers are capable workers, regardless of where they come from." The work details continued 3 times weekly through July and into August 1945. The German women gradually adapted to the brutal Texas heat, learned to pace themselves during outdoor work, and began developing calluses on their soft hands. More importantly, they began absorbing cowboy culture through immersion, learning things that couldn't be taught through formal instruction. They learned that cowboys had their own code of behavior as rigid as any military protocol, but based on entirely different values. You didn't lie, you didn't steal, you didn't abuse animals, and you didn't shirk your share of the work. Beyond that, you were free to be yourself. The cowboys didn't care about your politics or your family background. They cared whether you pulled your weight and kept your word. Margarete Schneider, who'd been terrified of horses initially, found herself drawn to the animals with an intensity that surprised her. One of the ranch hands, an older cowboy named Samuel Johnson, noticed her interest and began teaching her basic horsemanship during lunch breaks. He started with groundwork, showing her how to approach a horse, how to read its body language, how to establish trust through patience and consistency. "A horse knows if you're afraid," Samuel explained through halting German and hand gestures supplemented by the translator. "But it also knows if you're honest. You can't fake confidence with a horse. You have to feel it, earn it through experience." Same with people. Really. Margarete found profound truth in this cowboy wisdom. In Germany, she'd been taught to fake everything: loyalty to the party, belief in the Führer, confidence in ultimate victory. Here in Texas, working with horses and cowboys, honesty seemed to matter more than ideology. By mid-August, several of the German women could ride well enough to help with basic cattle work. Tom Baylor, impressed by their progress, began teaching them to use lassos for practical ranch tasks. Gerda Hoffmann discovered she had natural hand-eye coordination for roping. Within 2 weeks of practice, she could lasso a fence post from 20 feet away with reasonable consistency. The cowboys praised her skill with genuine respect, and that respect meant more to her than any military commendation she'd received in the Wehrmacht auxiliary services. The cultural exchange flowed both ways. The German women taught the ranch wives how to make traditional German bread, dark and dense and satisfying in ways that white American bread wasn't. Elise Becker, who'd studied music before the war, sang German folk songs during evening breaks that left the cowboys sitting in respectful silence. These weren't Nazi marching songs or propaganda tunes. They were ancient melodies about harvest and love and loss that transcended national boundaries. One evening in late August, after a particularly long day of work preparing fields for fall planting, the cowboys built a fire in a pit behind the bunkhouse. Someone produced a guitar, someone else brought out a harmonica, and an impromptu music session began. The cowboys played Western songs the German women had never heard, ballads about lonesome trails and lost loves that somehow sounded universal despite the foreign language. Then Danny Pierce did something unexpected. He handed his guitar to Marguerite and gestured for her to play. She hesitated, then began picking out a melody from her childhood, a simple folk tune her grandmother had taught her. The cowboys listened intently. When she finished, Charlie Hendricks said through the translator, "That's pretty music. Different from ours, but pretty. Play another one." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The music around the fire that night represented something larger than entertainment. It was a moment of genuine cultural exchange between people who should have been eternal enemies, but instead had found common ground through work, music, and the shared experience of human struggle. The German women realized that American culture, particularly this Texas cowboy culture, had depth and tradition that Nazi propaganda had never acknowledged. The cowboys realized that German people weren't monsters, just ordinary humans who'd been caught up in a monstrous system. September 1945 brought news that would change everything for the detained German women. Allied authorities in Europe had stabilized the occupation zones, and repatriation procedures were being established. The women at Fort Sam Houston were informed that they'd likely be shipped back to Germany by the end of the year. The news was received with mixed emotions. They wanted to go home, wanted to find surviving family members, wanted to rebuild their lives. But many had grown attached to Texas, to the routines they'd established, to the people they'd met. The work details continued, but now with a bittersweet quality. The German women knew their time in Texas was limited, and they absorbed everything with heightened intensity. The cowboys, aware the women would soon leave, made efforts to teach them skills they could take back to Germany. Tom Baylor gave Gerda a well-used but serviceable lariat as a gift. "You've earned it," he said simply. "Maybe you won't have cattle to rope back home, but you'll have the skill, and nobody can take that from you." Betty Schultz organized a farewell gathering in early October, inviting all the German women who'd worked at the ranch over the previous months. It wasn't a formal party, just a Sunday afternoon meal under the pavilion with more food than necessary and an unspoken acknowledgement that something meaningful was ending. The women brought German dishes they'd prepared in the Fort Sam Houston kitchens. The ranch families contributed their specialties. The result was a feast that blended two food cultures separated by an ocean and a world war. After the meal, Tom Baylor stood up and cleared his throat awkwardly. Public speaking wasn't his strength, but he had something to say. "We didn't know what to expect when they told us German prisoners would be working here," he began. "Figured they'd be trouble, or useless, or both. But you ladies proved us wrong. You worked hard, learned fast, and earned your place. In my book, that makes you cowboys, honorary anyway. When you get back to Germany, you tell folks that not all Americans are what your leaders said we were, and we'll remember that not all Germans were what our leaders said you were. The German women understood enough English by then to grasp his meaning even before the translator finished. Several were crying, including Gerda, who'd become something of a leader among the group. She stood and responded in careful, practiced English she'd been learning. We come here as enemies. We leave as, I don't know English word. Not friends exactly, but not enemies. Thank you for teaching us about Texas, about cowboys, about America that is real, not propaganda America. The farewell gathering at the Schultz Ranch marked the end of one chapter, but not the end of the story. The German women returned to Fort Sam Houston and spent the following weeks in administrative limbo, waiting for ships and paperwork that would transport them back across the Atlantic. During this time, several of them maintained correspondence with the Texas families they'd met, letters carefully vetted by military censors, but still conveying genuine emotion and gratitude. In late November 1945, the women finally received their orders. They would board a transport ship in New Orleans on December 3rd, bound for Bremen in the American occupation zone of Germany. The journey back would take them through a world utterly transformed from the one they'd left. Germany lay in ruins, divided among victorious powers, its future uncertain. What awaited them was likely to be cold, hungry, and difficult. The morning they departed Fort Sam Houston, several of the cowboys who'd worked with them at various ranches showed up to say goodbye. This wasn't officially sanctioned, but nobody stopped them. Jake Matheson brought his grandmother, who spoke to the women in the Bavarian German of her childhood, blessing them and wishing them safety. Charlie Hendricks handed Marguerite a small wooden carving of a horse he'd made himself, wrapped in newspaper. "So you remember," he said simply. The women boarded the trucks in tears, waving to the small group of Texans who'd somehow become important in their lives despite every historical and political force that should have kept them apart. As the convoy rolled away from Fort Sam Houston toward the railroad station, Gerda Hoffman looked back at the Texas landscape one final time, trying to memorize the flat horizons and endless sky. The ship journey back to Germany was everything the original Atlantic crossing had been, cramped, uncomfortable, and filled with uncertainty. But the women who'd worked on Texas ranches carried something intangible with them. They'd seen a different America than the one Nazi propaganda had described. They'd met men whose strength came from individual skill and personal pride rather than state coercion. They'd experienced a culture that valued practical competence over ideological purity, that judged people by their character rather than their nationality. When they finally arrived in Bremen in late December 1945, they found a Germany that barely resembled the country they'd left. Cities were rubble, infrastructure was destroyed, millions were homeless, displaced, starving. The women scattered to search for surviving family members, to begin the long process of rebuilding lives in a nation that had been thoroughly defeated and occupied. But the connections forged in Texas didn't immediately disappear. Despite the chaos of post-war Europe and the difficulty of international correspondence, some of the German women managed to maintain contact with their Texas acquaintances. Letters took months to arrive, often traveling through military postal systems and Red Cross channels. But they came, carried across an ocean by determination on both sides to preserve something meaningful that had emerged from unexpected circumstances. Gerda Hoffman eventually settled in Hamburg, where she found work as a translator for American occupation forces, skills with English she'd developed in Texas serving her well. In 1948, she received a care package from Betty Schultz containing coffee, sugar, and a photograph of the ranch. The accompanying letter, written in simple English that Gerda could now read without difficulty, described how the ranch had survived the post-war adjustments, how the cattle operation was expanding, how life was returning to normal in Texas while Europe still struggled. Margarete Schneider had lost everything in the war. Her family home in Stuttgart had been destroyed by Allied bombing. Her parents were dead. Her brother was missing, presumed killed on the Eastern Front. She spent years in displaced persons camps, working odd jobs, trying to build something from nothing. But she kept Charlie Hendricks' carved wooden horse through all of it, a tangible reminder that even in humanity's darkest moments, individual kindness could survive. The stories of these women gradually faded into obscurity. They weren't celebrated heroes or notorious villains, just ordinary people who'd found themselves in extraordinary circumstances. Most lived quiet post-war lives, marrying, raising children, working regular jobs in the new West Germany that emerged from occupation. They rarely spoke publicly about their experiences in Texas. The topic was complicated, potentially problematic. How do you explain that your American captors treated you better than your own government ever had? How do you reconcile gratitude toward enemies with loyalty to your devastated homeland? But they told their children in private moments. They shared stories about working on Texas ranches, about learning to ride horses, about cowboys who taught them to rope cattle and treated them with unexpected respect. These stories became family legends, passed down through generations, gaining detail and meaning over time. In the 1970s, as Cold War tensions eased and historical research into World War II expanded, a few journalists and historians began documenting the experiences of German POWs in America, most focused on male soldiers held in large camps across the United States. The story of German women auxiliaries who'd worked on Texas ranches remained largely unknown, a footnote in a footnote, too small and too complicated for mainstream historical narratives. But in 1982, a German television documentary team tracking unusual World War II stories discovered Gerda Hoffmann living in Hamburg. She was 63 years old by then, a grandmother, retired from decades of work as a translator and teacher. When the documentary team asked about her wartime experiences, she initially demurred. Then they mentioned they were specifically interested in German women who'd been detained in America. Gerda's face changed. She disappeared into another room and returned with a wooden box containing letters, photographs, and a worn lariat. "I haven't talked about this in years," she said, "but maybe it's time." Over the following hours, she told them everything: the capture, the transport to Texas, the terror and confusion, the gradual realization that Americans weren't the monsters propaganda had portrayed, the cowboys who'd taught her to rope and ride, the farewell gathering at the Schultz Ranch. The documentary team tracked down other women from the same group. They found Margarete in Stuttgart, still keeping Charlie Hendricks' carved horse in a place of honor. They located Elise in Berlin, who'd become a music teacher and still sang the cowboy songs she'd learned around Texas campfires. They interviewed 8 women in total, each with similar stories of culture shock, gradual acceptance, unexpected kindness, and transformative encounters with a way of life completely foreign to their experience. The documentary aired in Germany in 1983 and caused a minor sensation. Here was a completely unknown aspect of the war. German women working on American ranches, learning cowboy skills, developing relationships with their former enemies. The story resonated because it was so unexpected, so contrary to standard narratives about World War II as a Manichaean struggle between absolute good and evil. The broadcast prompted letters from other women who'd had similar experiences but had never spoken publicly about them. A woman in Munich wrote describing how she'd worked on a ranch near Abilene, learning to break horses under the tutelage of a 70-year-old cowboy who treated her like the granddaughter he'd lost to polio. Another woman from Frankfurt detailed her time at a dairy farm outside of Houston, where the owner's wife taught her to make butter and cheese using methods that differed fascinatingly from German techniques. These accounts revealed a broader pattern. Across Texas, small numbers of German women auxiliaries had been integrated into the wartime agricultural labor system, often working on ranches and farms where they encountered authentic cowboy culture. The experiences weren't uniform. Some women faced hostility from locals who'd lost sons in combat. Others encountered indifference or exploitation, but enough had positive, transformative experiences that a pattern emerged. Exposure to cowboy culture challenged their preconceptions about America in profound ways. The documentary also sparked interest in Texas. Several of the ranching families mentioned in the film were still operating in the 1980s, now run by second and third generations. When contacted by researchers, these families produced their own archives: letters from German women, photographs taken during work details, even a few diary entries that had been shared and then left behind when the women departed. The Schultz Ranch, still in family hands, opened a small museum in 1985 dedicated to the history of German labourers who'd worked there during and after the war. The exhibit featured tools the women had used, reproductions of meals served, photographs of cattle work, and most poignantly, a section of fence where prisoners and cowboys had first shared cigarettes and broken down barriers through simple human contact. In 1987, the ranch organized a reunion, inviting any surviving German women who'd worked there to return to Texas. 4 women made the journey, now in their 60s and 70s, accompanied by children and grandchildren. The local newspaper covered the event extensively, publishing photographs of elderly women standing in fields they'd worked 42 years earlier, now able to articulate in fluent English the impact those months had made on their understanding of the world. Gerda Hoffmann gave an interview during that visit that captured something essential about the experience. "We arrived as enemies, convinced Americans were everything our propaganda had told us, brutal, uncultured, obsessed only with money and pleasure. We discovered men whose code of honor put many German officers to shame, cowboys who valued honesty, hard work, and individual skill above ideology or nationalism. They taught us that strength doesn't require totalitarianism, that competence doesn't require cruelty, that pride can exist without supremacy. Those lessons saved some of us from the bitterness that consumed so many Germans after the war." The academic community gradually recognized the significance of these encounters. Historians studying post-war German-American relations noted that former POWs and detainees often became advocates for Atlantic partnership during the Cold War. The personal relationships formed during captivity, the exposure to American values in practice rather than propaganda, created a cohort of Germans who understood the United States in ways that purely academic or political knowledge couldn't replicate. Several of the women who'd worked on Texas ranches became influential in their own right during the post-war decades. Margarete Schneider eventually earned a university degree and became a professor of American Studies at the University of Stuttgart, teaching generations of German students about American culture with authority that came from lived experience. She kept Charlie Hendricks' carved horse on her desk throughout her career, and when students asked about it, she'd tell them the story of a Texas cowboy who treated an enemy with unexpected kindness. Elise Becker's musical career flourished in post-war Germany. She performed extensively, mixing classical German repertoire with American folk songs she'd learned in Texas. In 1968, she released an album titled Songs from Both Sides, featuring German and American music arranged to highlight universal themes. The album notes explained how she'd learned many of the American songs while detained in Texas, working alongside cowboys who'd shared their culture despite recent enmity. The correspondence between some of the German women and Texas families continued for decades. Jake Matheson, the cowboy who'd first pulled Gerda onto his horse, maintained a letter, exchanged with her until his death in 1979. His granddaughter, going through his effects, found over 200 letters spanning 34 years, documenting 2 lives unfolding on opposite sides of the Atlantic, connected by a brief period of shared experience during history's darkest chapter. The last surviving member of the original group of women detained at Fort Sam Houston was Anna Weber, the spokeswoman who'd organized the women during their captivity. She lived until 2003, reaching the age of 96. In her final years, she gave extensive interviews to historians and filmmakers documenting the POW experience. Her testimony provided crucial details about the administrative systems, the daily routines, and, most importantly, the psychological journey from enemy to something more complex. "People want simple stories," Anna said in a 2001 interview. "They want clear villains and heroes, but my experience in Texas was neither simple nor clear. I was part of a system that committed unimaginable evil. That guilt stays with you forever. but I also experienced unexpected humanity from people who had every right to hate me. Those cowboys didn't excuse what Germany had done. They just chose to see me as an individual, not as a symbol. That distinction, that American ability to separate ideology from humanity, was something our system never understood. It's why we lost, and why America, for all its flaws, represents something genuinely different in the world. The broader historical significance of these encounters extends beyond individual stories. The treatment of German POWs and detainees in America, particularly the integration of women auxiliaries into agricultural labor systems, represented a practical application of democratic values during wartime. The United States could have retaliated for Nazi atrocities with cruelty of its own. Many Americans wanted exactly that, but institutional commitment to Geneva Convention standards, combined with practical labor needs and a cultural inclination toward judging individuals by their actions, created conditions where enemies could become, if not friends, then at least human beings worthy of basic dignity. The cowboy culture that so profoundly affected the German women embodied values that translated across cultural boundaries. The emphasis on individual competence, the respect earned through hard work, the informal egalitarianism that cared more about what you could do than who your parents were. These principles resonated with people raised in a hierarchical, class-conscious society precisely because they offered an alternative model of human organization. The women's experiences also highlighted gender dynamics in interesting ways. In Nazi Germany, women's roles had been strictly defined: mothers, homemakers, supporters of male achievement. The auxiliary services were sold as extensions of domestic duty, women supporting men who did the real work of war. But on Texas ranches, these women discovered they could do work they'd been told was beyond female capability. They could ride horses, rope cattle, endure brutal heat, and earn respect from men whose culture valued competence regardless of gender. This wasn't feminist enlightenment in the modern sense. The Texas cowboys of 1945 held plenty of traditional views about gender roles. But ranch work had always demanded that everyone pull their weight, and if a woman could do the job, pragmatism trumped ideology. For German women raised in a system where biology was destiny and traditional roles were enforced with state power, the sight of ranch wives who ran businesses, managed livestock, and made decisions alongside men provided yet another challenge to everything they'd been taught. The physical artifacts that survive from this period tell their own stories. Museums across Texas hold items made or used by German detainees, leather goods crafted during free time, tools adapted for women's hands, photographs capturing moments of work and rest, letters describing experiences that seemed impossible to their recipients back in war-torn Germany. Each object represents a small node of connection between cultures that should have remained forever separated by war and ideology. The historical markers at former detention sites preserve memory for future generations. The marker at Fort Sam Houston, erected in 1992, reads in part, "Here, German women auxiliaries detained after World War II discovered that their captors judged them by their character rather than their nationality. The relationships formed during this period contributed to post-war reconciliation and demonstrated that even in the aftermath of total war, human dignity could be preserved through adherence to law and moral principle." Similar markers exist at several of the ranches that employed German labor, though these are often smaller, more personal tributes funded by families rather than government agencies. The Schultz Ranch marker, placed in 1985, simply states, "On this land, former enemies worked alongside each other, learned from each other, and discovered their common humanity. May we never forget that even in war's darkest moments, individual acts of decency can illuminate paths toward peace." The legacy of these encounters extends to the present day. Descendants of the German women and the Texas cowboys maintain connections through social media, genealogy research, and occasional reunions. In 2015, 70 years after the war's end, a gathering in San Antonio brought together over 300 people connected to this history, grandchildren and great-grandchildren of both the detained women and the ranching families who'd employed them. The event featured historical displays, academic presentations, and personal testimony from descendants who'd grown up hearing stories about the unexpected friendships formed in 1945. A German woman in her 40s described visiting the Schultz ranch and riding horses there, following in her grandmother's footsteps. A Texas rancher in his 50s talked about corresponding with his grandfather's German pen pal for 20 years after his grandfather's death, maintaining a connection that had started with shared cigarettes through barbed wire. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.